The mist comes off Maryvale Creek at first light, moves across a lawn that is not a lawn anymore, and lays itself down over 11 inches of standing water that no one in the county has been able to explain for 48 years. A Georgian manor rises out of that water. 3 stories, twin chimneys, a wing gone to sky through the collapsed slate of its own roof. At the front steps, a leather valise. Beside it, a boot in cracked brown leather. The stocking above it is wet only on the left side. An auburn head lifts. Gray-green eyes read the flooded drive the way another woman would read a telegram. In one hand, a tarnished brass skeleton key on a ribbon the color of tea. In the pocket of an olive coat patched at the elbow, $11.40. Behind her, a village that has already decided she will not last the month. She steps into the water. She did not get the house on Beacon Hill. She did not get the mill shares. She did not get a single dollar from the bank in Boston. She got a manor in Vermont. $6. That was what 14 rooms and 8 acres had failed to sell for at auction 4 years earlier. $6. And nobody had raised a hand. But the real wealth was never the manor. The real wealth was hidden behind 11 inches of standing water on 8 acres of ground. Her grandmother had drowned on purpose, waiting for a woman who was willing to wade in and stay. The solicitor's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and the man reading the will was named Pembroke, and he never once lifted his eyes from the page. He read the way a man reads a grocery list when he already knows what is on it. Beacon Hill house to Prescott, textile shares to Prescott, savings at the First National to Prescott, furniture silver, the little walnut escritoire from the front parlor, the Waltham Railroad chronometer, the paintings on the west wall of the parlor. Prescott, Prescott, Prescott. And then Maryvale Grange, Vermont, to Linnea. Prescott Ashmere sat across the mahogany table in his charcoal frock coat, in his burgundy waistcoat, and his gold pocket watch chain caught the light from the gas sconce on the wall behind him. He was 43 years old. He had been 43 years old for as long as Linnea could remember. Something about the way his face was cut made him look permanent, like weather, like a season you had to wait out. He consulted the watch the moment Pembroke reached the word Vermont, not with surprise, with satisfaction. The gold-rimmed oval spectacles on his nose caught the light and threw it back into the room in 2 small polished coins. He did not look at her. He did not need to. He had known before he came in what she was going to get. The 2 cousins seated by the window laughed. Not loudly. That would have been honest. They laughed the way people laugh at a funeral when someone finally says the thing everyone has been thinking. A soft shared breath. A confirmation. An aunt by marriage covered her mouth with a lace handkerchief and looked very carefully at her lap. Pembroke kept reading. He kept his eyes on the paper and made a small, precise note in the margin and moved on. Because that was the thing about Maryvale Grange. It had gone up for auction 4 years back. In 1918, the county had advertised it in 3 newspapers, and the walkthrough had been open for a week, and a lawyer from Montpelier had stood in the front hall of the manor with a hammer in his hand and had waited. He had waited an hour and a half. He had read from the printed sheet. 12 principal rooms, 8 acres of grounds, a walled kitchen garden, a stone stable block, a Georgian frontage that had once been photographed for an architectural journal in 1889. And then he had asked for opening bids. $6. That was what came out of the room. $6 from a farmer in the second row who had come in mostly to get out of the cold. And nobody said 7, nobody said 6.50. The lawyer waited a full minute, and then he did not bring the hammer down. He said the auction was suspended. He said the property would remain in the estate. He put his hat back on, and he left. And the farmer who had said $6 because he thought he was starting the bidding walked out of that room, the only man in Vermont who had ever offered money for the place. $6. That was what Linnea inherited. The thing nobody would pay 7 for. Now let me stop here for a minute and tell you who this young woman was. Because if you understand her at all before we walk her through that gate, everything after makes a different kind of sense. Linnea Ashmere was 23 years old. She had auburn hair pulled back at the nape of her neck with a tortoiseshell clip Her mother had left her, and she wore an olive green wool coat that she had patched at the right elbow herself in brown thread, because the wool for a matching patch had cost 11 cents at the notions counter, and she had not had 11 cents to spare. She had gray-green eyes that did not blink much, and boots, brown leather, scuffed at the toes. The left sole cracked near the ball of the foot, so that when she walked in wet weather, her stocking got wet on the left side, but not the right. She had been married once. His name was Wesley Marchant. He was a school teacher's son from Worcester, and he had enlisted in 1917, the way half the young men in Massachusetts had enlisted in 1917, because it had seemed at the time like the thing a young man did. They had been married 5 months when he sailed, and he had lasted 8 more months. He was killed in Flanders in the fall of 1918 in a place with a name Linnea could not pronounce even now, because every time she tried to say it, she got as far as the second syllable and stopped. She did not cry when the telegram came. She noted dully that she should be crying. She noted dully that she was not. Then she got up and made tea. She had been making tea and doing arithmetic ever since. The arithmetic was this: Wesley had died and left behind not grief but debt. A second mortgage on the little brick house in South Boston that Linnea had believed was paid for. A note at a private lender that carried Wesley's signature, but that Linnea had never seen. Doctor's bills from the winter before he shipped out when he had been sick and had told no one. Creditors who arrived in the parlor with polite hats in their hands and papers in their pockets and 30-day notices to vacate. She fought it for 4 months. She lost. She moved into a boarding house on Waltham Street in the South End, where the room cost $9 a week, and the mattress smelled of camphor, and the window looked out onto an air shaft where somebody's laundry hung permanent and gray. She was there for 4 years, not because she was lazy, because there was nowhere else to go. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. Prescott was Prescott. And Boston in 1922 did not have room for a widow with an olive green coat and $11 in her pocket. 3 weeks. That was what her savings covered when she got the telegram from Pembroke to come to the office for the reading of her grandmother's will. 3 more weeks of rent. And then the boarding house lady, who was not unkind, only tired, would have to ask her to leave. And then Linnea Ashmere, 23 years old, widow of Flanders, was going to be a woman on a bench. So when Pembroke said the word, Merivale and Prescott smiled without looking at her, and the cousins laughed. Linnea Ashmere thought, I will take it, because what else was there to take? She said nothing at the table. She signed where Pembroke put his finger. She accepted from him a brass skeleton key on a frayed ribbon of what had once been indigo silk and was now the color of tea. She put the key in her coat pocket. She stood. She thanked Pembroke, who did not look at her either. She walked out into the November street, and she took the streetcar back to the boarding house, and she packed her one leather valise with brass corners and the little cracked mirror inside the lid. And the next morning at 6, she was on the northbound train. Nobody saw her off. There was nobody to see her off. The train took her most of a day. Boston, then out through the low mill towns, then across into Vermont, in the country flattening and rising by turns, in the leaves already fallen, in the ground already the color of dishwater. She changed twice. She ate a hard-boiled egg and half a roll from her coat pocket, and she drank cold tea from a jar. Somewhere north of Bellows Falls, she fell asleep with her forehead against the window, and she woke up in a station where the platform was empty, and the wind was coming off the river, and somebody, a station master in a wool cap, called Windham County, twice before she realized he meant her. There was a man with a cart. She had written ahead. The cart cost her 30 cents. The driver did not talk. His name was Blaine, and he had gray whiskers, and he chewed something the whole way, and he did not offer her a blanket, though she saw one folded on the bench beside him. The road went uphill for a mile out of the village, and then flat along a ridge, and then down again to a lower ground where the trees closed in. And where the road bottomed out, the horse balked, just stopped. Blaine clicked his tongue at it, and the horse turned its head sideways and refused to move forward. Blaine spat over the wheel and got down and unhitched the traces at the harness ring, and led the horse back a length. Then he looked at her and his voice came out flat and unbothered, as though he had told this news to somebody every autumn of his working life and was tired of the sound of it. Water was up on the drive. Horse would not cross. She was walking it from here. He did not offer to walk with her. He handed down her valise. He waited long enough to be paid the 30 cents, and then he backed the horse and turned the cart, and he went back the way he had come without looking behind him. His wheels made a wet sound in the road for a long time. Linnea stood there with the valise in her right hand and the brass key on its frayed ribbon in her left. And she looked down the lane, and she saw why the horse had refused. The water started 20 yards ahead. It was not a puddle. It was not a stream across the road. It was a shallow lake. Brown water the color of steep tea, flat and still and continuous, stretching from the base of a low stone wall on her right, all the way past a rusted iron gate on her left, and out into what she understood slowly was the driveway to the house. The lane did not go around it. There was no going around it. The water had swallowed the road. Rain had started up while she was on the train. Fine and sideways, more mist than weather. It had soaked through her olive coat at the shoulders and darkened the brown patch at her elbow. Her stocking on the left side was already wet from the cracked boot. She looked at the water. She looked at her valise. She thought in a small, clear voice inside her head, this is where it stops. This is where a sensible woman would turn around. Except she had nowhere to turn around to, so she stepped in. The water came up over the tops of her boots on the first step. It was cold enough that her teeth clenched all on their own without her deciding. She lifted the hem of her coat with her right hand. Though it was too late, the coat was already wet and she carried the valise higher and she waited. The village had watched her come through. She had known it at the time. There had been curtains that moved in windows on the main street. Not one door had opened. Not one voice had called out. They had known who she was, and more than that, they had known where she was walking to. And that had been enough to keep them all behind glass. She waded up the drive. The water was ankle deep on the gravel and shin deep in the low places, and she felt through the sole of her boot where the drive rose slightly and where it dipped, and she read the land through her feet. And then ahead of her, through the mist in the leafless trees, she saw the house. The pictures in the architectural journal from 1889 must have been beautiful. She could see it in the bones of the thing even now. Georgian stone, 3 stories, 12 principal rooms. The kind of proportions somebody had cared very much about getting right once, a long time ago. Twin chimneys, a pediment above the front door that had been carved with a wreath and was now spotted black with lichen. The east wing roof had fallen in. She could see sky through the upper windows in that wing, not a small hole. The whole slate roof on that end had collapsed inward, and the timber stood up out of the wreckage, like the ribs of something that had died in the winter and been picked clean by spring. The pitch of the roof on the surviving side sagged at the ridgeline in a slow curve the way a beam sags when the load has been on it too long. Dead ivy climbed the west face in brittle brown sheets. The kitchen garden wall on the north side was down in 3 places, and the front steps of the house descended very deliberately into the standing water. Water lapped at the 4th step from the top. The smell hit her from 20 feet away. It was not the smell she had expected. It was not sewage, and it was not rot exactly. It was cold stone and old iron and something faintly mineral underneath, like the taste of well water in a house that has been closed up too long. Under that wet plaster, under that the very faint, clean smell of lime. She waded to the door. The key fit. She was not sure it would. She had been not sure the whole way up the lane, but it fit. The lock ground with rust, and then it turned with a sound like a small bone cracking, and the door swung inward, and the door swung inward onto water. The front hall was flooded to a depth of 6 inches. The parquet floor was gone, warped up in a shallow wave at the center, and the water pooled along the baseboards on all 4 sides. A tall clock stood against the far wall. It had stopped a long time ago. Its face was the color of old milk. She stepped in. She was already wet. What did it matter? She walked through the ground floor room by room, and she counted the damage the way a woman counts wounds after a fall. Drawing room, ceiling buckled, long strips of plaster hanging like peeled skin from the lath. Library, floorboards heaved up into a frozen wave at the center, water pooling in the trough around them. Dining room, intact walls, flooded floor, one window cracked but holding. Parlor, damp. Music room, damp. A back scullery, damp. The kitchen, worse than any of them. The great cast iron range, half-submerged black iron crusted with a pale mineral scale like frost on the outside of a jar. But she put her hand on the edge of the range and pulled, and the iron held. Something in the house had not yet given up. The staircase groaned at her weight on the first tread. She stopped. She put her hand on the banister and pressed, and it was loose in her palm, but the newel post at the bottom did not shift. She tried the second tread. It complained. It held. Third, fourth. Each one groaned like a knee going up. Each one held. The wood underneath the softened top layer was oak dense and dark and stubborn, and it had not yet decided to fall. Upstairs the corridor. 12 rooms on this floor, and most of them open to the sky or to water damage that had come in through the sky or to the mildew that follows both. She walked slowly. Her boots left dark prints on the runner where the runner still existed. The east wing corridor was blocked halfway down by a section of ceiling that had fallen through and made a small landslide of plaster and lath and rat-eaten insulation. She did not go past it. She went the other way. At the very end of the west corridor, past the last bedroom on the left, in the last bedroom on the right, there was a door. The door was closed. She turned the knob. It opened easily without any of the swelling that had jammed the two doors before it, and the room inside was dry, completely dry. She stood in the doorway with her valise dripping onto the runner behind her, and she looked at a room the whole house had somehow agreed not to touch. The ceiling was intact. The plaster had cracks in its hairline, running out from the corner like a small river drawn on a map, but the cracks were dry. The wallpaper was faded but had not peeled. There was a bare iron bed frame pushed against the far wall under a window, and a small nightstand beside it with a china pitcher standing empty on top and a straight-backed wooden chair by the door. And on the windowsill in the last thin gray light of the November afternoon sat a cat. Not a kitten, a grown cat. Gray tabby the color of pewter. It was thin. Its ribs made shallow ridges through the fur on its side. Its ears were small, and one of them, the left, had a clean triangular notch out of the top of it, like a piece that had been snipped away with scissors long ago and had healed cleanly. Its tail curled once around its paws, and the very tip of the tail was white. Its eyes were yellow, the pale smoky yellow of hay dust in a sunbeam, and it looked at her without any surprise. It did not come to her. It did not run. It watched her come into the room, and it accepted her. Linnea set the valise down on the bare iron bed. She placed the brass key on the nightstand next to the china pitcher, and the tarnished brass made a small, definite sound against the wood. She took one candle out of her valise and one match from the little tin in the inner pocket of her coat, and she struck the match on the sole of her boot, and the flame caught, and she cupped her hand around it until it steadied, and she set the candle in a puddle of its own wax on the china pitcher saucer. The cat watched her. Downstairs under the dry floorboards of this one dry room, she could hear the sound of water. Not fast, not panicked, measured. The sound of a house counting something. She could hear it drip inside the walls. She could hear it move in the cellar 12 steps down from the door under the staircase. 12 steps that vanished into a dark she had not yet opened. The water had been down there for a long time, and it was down there still, and it was patient. She thought it has been waiting for me. Then she corrected herself, because that was a foolish thought, and she did not have room for foolish thoughts. It had not been waiting for her. It had simply been waiting, whether she came or not. The cat blinked. It shifted its front paws minutely on the sill. It did not blink again for a long time. She sat down on the edge of the bare iron bed, and she put her hands on her knees, and she looked at the cat, and the cat looked at her, And outside the window, it was getting dark, and she was 23 years old, and she was in Vermont, and she was alone. Damn, she thought. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't helpless. But 11 inches of water has its own arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care what you feel about it. She slept in her coat. She did not have blankets. The mattress ticking was stiff and smelled of cedar. She lay on her side and she pulled her knees up. And after a while, the cat came down off the sill and jumped up onto the foot of the bed with a soundlessness cats have when they have decided to trust something, and it settled against the small of her back through the coat, and it purred once, and then it was silent, and she slept. She dreamed of Wesley. Not the Wesley in the last photograph, the one in the ill-fitting uniform on the front steps of the little brick house in South Boston. The Wesley from before. The one who had leaned in the kitchen doorway on a Sunday morning with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows and had watched her make coffee. She dreamed she was making coffee, and he was watching, and she dreamed there was water on the floor coming up around her ankles, and she was trying to sweep it toward the door, and it kept coming back. And Wesley was not saying anything. He was just watching. And in the dream, she understood without being told that he was not going to help. He was not there to help. He was there because he had always been there, and that was all. She woke in the dark. Something was making a sound outside her window, a methodical sound, a grinding, like metal on stone. She sat up. The candle had gone out. The cat was gone from the foot of the bed. Very faint through the window, she could see the shape of the dead ivy on the west wall in the last of the moonlight. And she could see something below it at the corner of the house. She could not see what. She lay back down. She did not sleep again. Dawn came slowly through a window that had not been washed in a decade. The glass filtered the light gray-green and unreal, and Linnea sat up in her wet coat and her wet boots, and she pushed the hair back from her face with both hands, and she went to the window. There was nobody in the yard. The dead ivy hung as it had hung. The ground still lay under their thin brown lake. She could see the shape of the gravel drive as a slightly paler brown under the water, and she could see the shape of the fallen east wing roof against the sky. But the front gate was straight. She had not registered the day before that the gate had been leaning, that both hinges had sheared, that the wood had been dragging in the mud when she had come up the lane. She had registered it only as something wrong. Now from the second floor window she could see the gate standing upright on its posts. Squared, new hinge pins, the gravel around the base of the near post disturbed. She went downstairs. The kitchen range was cold. She was cold. She was hungry. She had one apple in her valise and half a hard-boiled egg wrapped in butcher paper, and she ate both of them standing at the kitchen table looking out the window at the flooded grounds, and then she went to work. She needed heat before anything else. She could not think clearly wet. She found a small stack of split wood in the scullery, dry, careful, the sticks laid the way. Somebody who knew how to lay a wood stack had laid them. Not recent, not old either. She built a fire in the range. The range was iron and iron would hold. The kindling caught. The smoke came back into the room. The flue was blocked. Of course it was. She should have expected that. She killed the fire with water from the hall, which she had no shortage of, and she stood in the kitchen watching gray smoke curl along the ceiling. And under her breath she said one word, and it was not a word her mother would have approved of. She went outside to look at the chimney. She was in the kitchen garden, standing in 6 inches of water, tilting her head up to squint at the flue cap 3 stories above her when she heard boots on the drive. She turned. A man was walking up her drive. Through the water, without hesitating at the edge of it, without pausing to look for a dry path. Walking straight up the middle of the gravel drive in a pair of heavy black work boots that were already dark to the ankle. Broad-shouldered, tall, 6 feet maybe more. He wore a dark navy canvas work jacket with brass buttons and a plain collarless shirt buttoned at the throat. His hair was dark brown-gray at the temples, cropped short in the way of a man who did not want to have to think about it. Late 50s, she thought, maybe 60, B. I walked to the base of the west chimney, and he set down a battered green canvas tool bag with a leather handle worn smooth by long use. He looked up at the flue. He did not look at her. The word came out low. Jackdaws. Then after a beat every fall. Then he set a ladder against the wall of the house. She had not seen him carrying a ladder. It had appeared like the fixed gate had appeared. He climbed, 4 rungs, 5, 6. He moved with a kind of deliberate economy she was going to learn to recognize, but did not yet have a name for. He did not test each rung. He simply climbed. At the eve, he swung himself onto the slate still without hurrying, and he crossed the roof to the flue cap, and he began pulling debris out of it with his bare hands. Sticks, mud, a whole nest of woven twigs the size of a pie plate, small bones. He tossed them down the slope of the roof, and they clattered into the water at the base of the wall. She watched him work for a full minute before she found a question worth putting to him. How had he known it was blocked? He did not answer it at first. He finished what he was doing. He wiped his hand on his trousers, and he came back down the ladder, taking the rungs slowly because there was ice in the grooves. And when he was on the ground and level with her again, he picked up the green canvas bag. Then he looked at her. His eyes were the pale blue of glacier ice. There were 3 freckles on his right temple in a small triangle. His face was weathered the way an oak fence post gets weathered, not damaged, only used. Smoke in the kitchen. He had seen it from the ridge, which was not really an answer, because the ridge was half a mile away and she had killed that fire 20 minutes ago. She opened her mouth. He turned. He walked back down the drive straight through the water without looking at her once more. At the gate, the newly hung gate, he paused. He did not turn around. Over his shoulder quietly, he told her to try the fire again. Then he was through the gate and going down the lane, and she stood in 6 inches of water in the kitchen garden with her hands shading her eyes, and she watched him go until she could not see him anymore. Then she went back inside and she tried the fire again. The kindling caught. The flame licked upward into the flue, and the draft pulled, and the smoke went where smoke was supposed to go, and the kitchen began for the first time in what must have been many years to get warm. She stood in front of the range with her wet coat opened and her wet hands held out to the heat, and she thought he did not tell me his name, and she thought I did not tell him mine. The fire cracked. The cat, which she had not seen since the night before, came in from wherever it had been and sat down 2 feet from the range in an attitude of complete ownership, and it began to wash the white tip of its tail. By afternoon, the kitchen was warm enough that she took off her coat. She hung it on a peg by the back door to dry. She heated water on the range. She washed her face at the pump in the scullery, which after some coaxing and some complaint gave up clean cold water that tasted faintly of stone and not of anything worse. She counted her money on the kitchen table. $11.40. She wrote the number down on the back of an envelope. She wrote a second number underneath it. The number of weeks, $11.40, would feed her at the prices she had seen in the village shop window the day before. 6 weeks, maybe 7 if she was careful with the flour. 7 weeks. Then the shop would stop letting her buy. Because 7 weeks was the point where you started to owe them, and they had already decided she was somebody who would not be paying it back. She thought about that. She thought about it for a while. She did not cry. She went to work on the kitchen. She scrubbed the top of the range with sand and water and a stiff brush she found on a hook in the pantry. She swept out the pantry, which had mouse droppings in the corners, but nothing worse. She wiped down the pine kitchen table with a rag until the surface under decades of grease showed pale honey-colored wood. She swept the flagstone floor. She used the broom to push water back out the kitchen door, which did not work, because the water outside was higher than the water inside. And the water came back over the threshold as she watched. She sat down on the flagstone floor with the broom across her knees, and she looked at the water sliding back into her kitchen, and she began unexpectedly to laugh. She laughed for perhaps a full minute. It was not a hysterical laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who has recognized that the water is going to have its say, and there is nothing to be done about it today. When she was finished laughing, she got up and she put the broom away, and she began methodically on the chimney breast. The stones in the chimney breast were fitted without mortar in the older way. Somebody had cut them by hand a long time ago, and set them together dry and let the weight of the stack above hold them in. In 2 or 3 places over the years, a mason had come in behind that and repointed the outer joints with lime. But the inner face of the chimney breast, where it stood inside the kitchen, was still bare stone. Linnea ran her hand along the stones about waist height, feeling for loose ones. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was killing time. She was cold and warm at the same time. Warm from the range and cold from the water. She wanted the wall to be solid because she wanted this room to be solid. She wanted at least one thing today to be what it looked like. Her fingers found a stone about 2 feet above the range and to the left. It moved, not much, a quarter of an inch. She pushed on it and it rocked. She pulled on it, it came out. Behind it was a cavity the size of a small loaf of bread. She stood very still. Then she reached into the cavity slowly because she remembered mice, and her fingers found not fur or straw or nesting, but leather. She drew out a book, small, leather-bound, the size of her palm. The binding was soft with age and dark with damp along one edge, and when she opened it, the pages inside crackled, but they were legible. The paper was rag paper thick, and the ink was iron gall ink faded from black to a deep rust brown that looked in the light from the kitchen window almost like dried blood. On the first page, in a hand that was small and tight and educated and unhurried, 3 lines. For whoever stays long enough to find this, OA 1858. She sat down on the kitchen flagstones without meaning to. Her knees folded and she sat, and the little book stayed open in her lap, and the cat came over and sat down beside her, and outside the flooded ground sat black and still under an early Vermont dusk. The fire in the range cracked once, and Linnea Ashmere, 23 years old, and 1 day into her inheritance, understood without yet having read a single entry that her grandmother had not left her a ruin. Her grandmother had left her a door, and somewhere in this house, somewhere under this water, somewhere behind these dry stones, was what her grandmother had wanted whoever came looking to find. She turned the page. She began to read. The first entry was dated the 11th of April, 1858. Ottilie had married a man named Alaric Ashmere on the 9th of April, 1858, in the parish church at the crossroads 2 miles east of the village. She was 22 years old. He was 28. They had come up together from Connecticut that spring, and he had bought the manor and the 8 acres and the 2 adjacent parcels for a sum she did not name in that first entry, but wrote around the way careful women wrote around money in journals in 1858. She said only that the price had been fair and that the seller had been eager and that her father had signed the bank draft in Hartford before she and Alaric had come north together. The manor was called Merivale in the county records, but the woman who had sold it to them had called it something else in Cornish that meant roughly the place where the water turns. Ottilie did not know what to make of that. She wrote it down anyway. She wrote everything down. That was the first thing Linnea understood about her grandmother from the journal. The woman had been an observer before she had been anything else. She had been an observer even at 22, even in her wedding week. The grounds in April of 1858 were dry. Ottilie wrote about the drainage on the second page. She wrote about it with the same flat, unromantic attention she had used to describe the ceremony. The land sloped south from the manor to a stream a quarter of a mile away, and the slope was gentle but continuous, and the subsoil was clay over limestone. The whole property shed water the way a waxed coat sheds rain. There was a stone-lined drainage channel that ran under the south lawn and emptied into the stream, and Ottilie had walked the length of it with a mason on the 14th of April, and the mason had told her it had been laid in 1803 by an Irishman with a very particular set of ideas about how a drain should be built, and it was still doing exactly what the Irishman had built it to do 55 years later. There were tenants, 6 families on the eastern parcels. Ottilie named them: the Ballards on the north corner, the Rundles, 2 Whitfield brothers with adjoining fields, a family named Cranmer, whose youngest boy was 5 years old and had a limp, a family named Loomis. She wrote their names in a neat column with a note beside each one about what they grew and what they owed and what she thought of them so far. Linnea sat on the kitchen flagstones with the book in her lap and read those names, and she thought those names are still here. She had heard the man at the general store address a customer as Mrs. Cranmer. She had ridden in from the station past a mailbox at the mouth of a farm lane that read Rundle in faded red paint. And a man named Whitfield, or a man who at least wore the face of a man whose father had been named Whitfield, had walked up her drive that morning through the water and had cleaned her chimney and had not told her his name. The names had stayed. She turned the page. 16 years passed in the journal in about 40 pages. Not because the years were empty, because Ottilie wrote sparely. A season would go by in 3 lines. A birth in the village, a death at the manor, the year the orchard failed, the year the orchard doubled. There was one page dated the winter of 1863 that was only a list of names, and beside each name, a small sum of money. Linnea read that page twice before she understood what it was. It was a list of families in the village to whom her grandmother had given money quietly that year so that they could get through the winter. Coal, she had written at the top of the page. Coal and flour. There was no fanfare about it. There was no reflection. Ottilie had simply written down the amounts and turned the page and gone on to spring. Linnea sat with the book open on her lap and thought about her grandmother, whom she had met exactly 3 times in her life. Once as a very small child in the parlor of the Beacon Hill house, where the old woman had been visiting from Vermont for reasons Linnea had never understood, and had sat very straight in a wing chair and had said almost nothing. Once at 8 at a Christmas dinner where Ottilie had been the only person at the table who had not made Linnea feel like an inconvenience. And once at 15 at her father's funeral where Ottilie had come down from Vermont in a black wool coat and had squeezed Linnea's hand once at the graveside and had told her so quietly nobody else at the graveside heard it that she had a spine and had better not lose it, and had then gone back to Vermont on the evening train. That was the woman. That was what Linnea had of her. And now in this book, in this small, careful hand, was the other side of it. The side nobody in Boston had known about. Her grandmother had been giving money away for decades. Not in flourishes, not in signed checks with her name on them. Quietly. A little every year. To the same families whose names Linnea had ridden past on the road up. She turned another page. The orchard on the north wall. Pear and damson. A note that the damsons had been particularly heavy that year, and Ottilie had made preserves for 11 households. A death. A tenant's child. Ottilie had paid for the burial and had not told the family she had done it. She had let the sexton say that the parish had covered it. The sexton had agreed because Ottilie had asked him to agree. A note that the drainage channel had cracked at slab number 4. That Alaric and 2 men from the village had opened up the south lawn and gone down to look at it. That the repair had been simple. Linnea kept reading. Nothing unusual. A working estate. A working marriage. Small kindnesses recorded in small columns. Then 1874. The handwriting changed. It was still Ottilie's. There was no mistaking it. But the letters pressed harder into the page. The pen strokes were shorter. Somebody had been writing fast, or writing angry, or writing while trying not to think about what she was writing. The entry was dated the 22nd of April, 1874. It began with a single line. They had opened the drain again that day. Linnea leaned closer to the candle. They had opened the drain again that day, Ottilie had written. Because slab number 7 had cracked in the spring frost, and Alaric said they should not wait a season, and the mason came out from the village with 2 apprentices, and they dug down 4 feet through the clay to the top of the covert. And here Ottilie's writing changed once more, and Linnea watched it change on the page like watching a face change in a bad light. What they had found beneath the channel floor, Ottilie wrote, changed the meaning of the land. There was a blank line. There was a blank line after that. Then, in a smaller hand, as though the writer had leaned closer to the paper to say it, Ottilie described sitting up until 3 in the morning with Alaric. They had agreed nothing would be recorded in the estate books. Nothing would be told to the mason. Nothing would be said to her father in Hartford. Nothing would be said to anyone. What they had found was theirs to hold, and the land above it was theirs to keep, and they were going to do what needed to be done to keep it. Linnea read the entry twice, 3 times. The candle on the china pitcher saucer had burned down to a stub. She did not notice. The cat had come and gone. She did not notice that either. Outside, the light had gone entirely, and the kitchen was lit only by the orange bloom of the range fire and the yellow tremble of the last inch of the candle. The entries that followed spanned weeks. April into May, May into June. They were not narrative entries anymore. They were procedural. Ottilie and Alaric had made a plan, and over the course of 6 weeks in the spring and early summer of 1874, they had carried out that plan. They had bricked over the drainage channel, both ends of it. Ottilie described it in the same careful, measured tone she had used to describe the wedding. The mason from the village was told the channel had failed beyond repair, that the slabs beneath were unstable, that the safest course was to seal it at the upstream inlet and let the south lawn drain naturally through the topsoil as the north lawn did. The mason had disagreed. Ottilie noted the disagreement. She noted the mason's name. She noted without embellishment that Alaric had paid the man a bonus of $120 for his cooperation, and that the mason had taken the money, and that he had gone back to the village and had told his family the drainage repair had gone smooth as glass. The upstream inlet was bricked in early May. The downstream outlet where the channel emptied into the stream was bricked in early June. Ottilie wrote the last of these entries with a hand that had steadied again. She had made her decision. She had lived with it for 2 months. The tone was calm. The channel was bricked at both ends, she wrote. The water would rise. The south grounds would flood within 2 seasons. The manor would begin to look what it was not. Better the world thought this place worthless than knew what it held. Linnea sat with the book in her lap for a very long time. The candle went out. She did not relight it. The fire in the range was still enough to see the pages by faintly. She turned to the next entry. It was dated the 11th of April, 1876. 2 full seasons had passed. Ottilie had opened the journal to the anniversary of her wedding, and she had written in a hand that had gone somewhere very quiet that the south lawn was underwater and the east lawn was underwater, and Merivale was now to the outside eye a ruined property, that she had refused 2 offers to purchase in the past month. The offers had been low and would have been lower if the offering parties had understood what lay beneath. They did not understand. That was the point. Alaric had said one day a woman of their blood would come to this house who was worthy of what they had buried. She would find it, or she would not. That would be her test, not theirs. Ottilie did not know if she would live to see her. She did not know if the woman would live to see them, but she was going to write for her, because someone must. Linnea closed the book. She held it in her lap with both hands. Outside, the flooded ground sat black and still under a November night, and the last of the fire in the range had gone red and low. And somewhere in the dark house, a floorboard settled, and somewhere else further off, a drop of water fell from a broken ceiling into a shallow pool and made a small, precise ring and was still. Linnea Ashmere, 23 years old, widow of Flanders, sat on the flagstones of a kitchen in Vermont with her grandmother's 48-year-old handwriting resting on her thigh. And she understood without yet knowing what her grandmother had buried that the water outside her window was not damage. The water was a door, and somewhere in this house or under it was the key. She stood up. She put the little leather book in the inner pocket of her coat where she had kept the tin of matches. She banked the fire in the range with the last of the split wood. She took the brass skeleton key off the nightstand upstairs when she went to bed, and she held it in her hand under the coat she used for a blanket. And she slept. The cat slept against her back. Somewhere down the lane in a small stone house at the end of a farm road, a man named Ansel Whitfield sat at his own kitchen table and drank tea and looked at nothing in particular. And a single thought passed through him without hurry. She had stayed the night. She would still be there in the morning. Then he got up, and he banked his own fire, and he went to bed, because he had been waiting a long time. and he could wait if he had to one day more. Morning came the way mornings come to a house that has been asleep too long, slowly, and without any real conviction that the day was going to amount to anything. Linnea woke with the little leather journal against her ribs, where it had slid inside her coat during the night, and the brass skeleton key still in her right hand, and the cat curled in the small of her back exactly where it had been when she had closed her eyes. The candle on the china pitcher saucer was a puddle of cold wax. The window glass was fogged from the inside. She could hear from the kitchen 2 floors below the faint tick of the range as it gave up the last of its heat. She lay there for a full minute without moving, because moving meant beginning, and beginning meant admitting she had woken up here in this house, in this bed, under this coat, beside a cat she had not owned yesterday, with her grandmother's 48-year-old confession pressed against her third rib. She sat up. The cat opened one eye. The cat closed it again. She read for an hour before she got out of bed. The journal in Audley's second decade at the manor had gone somewhere Linnea had not expected. It had gone patient. The frantic hand of the spring of 1874 had never come back. In its place was a woman who had made her peace with what she had done and had begun slowly to build a second life on top of it. The second life was the ledger. Audley did not call it a ledger in the journal. She called it, the first time she mentioned it, her quiet accounts. In an entry from November of 1876, she had written that she had begun to keep separate the sums she put out into the village, not for tax and not for record, for memory, because a thing done and not written was a thing that would vanish, and she did not want these to vanish even if the names attached to them must. Linnea read that entry twice. She thought about it. She thought about a woman sitting at a desk in this house in 1876, water on 3 sides of her, deciding to write down every single kindness she was going to do for the rest of her life, so that when she was dead and gone, somebody looking for it would know she had done them. That was not what Boston did. That was not what Prescott did. Prescott put his name on things and made sure other people saw it. His name was carved above the door of the mill office in Lowell. His name was on the letterhead of 3 charities in Boston that gave dinners and had them written up in the society column. Prescott understood at a level below thought that the point of doing a good thing was to be seen doing it. Audley had done the exact opposite for 53 years. The journal followed the ledger through the 1880s in glancing references. A note that the Ballards had needed help with the roof and had gotten it. A note that a Whitfield boy had wanted to try for the seminary in Burlington and had gone. A note that a widow in the village named Cranmer had lost her husband to a mill accident in Springfield, and Audley had paid the funeral costs through a third party, and the widow had gone the rest of her life believing the parish had done it, and the parish had gone the rest of its life believing an anonymous donor had done it, and only Audley had known the truth. Linnea sat up in bed. She swung her feet to the floor. The floorboards under her stockinged feet were dry and cold. The dry room, the one room in this whole ruined house that had not let a drop of water in, for who knew how long, felt for the first time since she had walked into it like a room somebody had prepared. Not for her personally, for whoever came. She dressed. She put the journal back in the inner pocket of her coat. She went downstairs. The fire in the range was cold. She built it again. It caught easily this time because the flue was clear, and she thought without wanting to think it of a man in a dark navy canvas jacket standing 3 stories above her, the morning before pulling twigs out of a chimney with his bare hands. She did not know his name. She was going to have to know it soon. She heated water. She ate the last of the bread from her valise. She stood at the kitchen window with the cup of hot water warming her palms, and she looked out at the drowned kitchen garden, and she thought about what she needed to do next, which was everything. She needed to eat. She needed to be warm at night. She needed to keep the fire in the range. She needed lime. She needed lath. She needed to replaster the library ceiling before the winter set in for real, because if she did not, the library was going to be gone by March, and if the library went, the whole West Wing would go with it. She needed nails. She needed putty. She needed a slate hammer because the East Wing roof was going to need slates before spring, and she was not going to be able to afford a roofer. She needed money. She had $11.40. She sat down at the kitchen table with the envelope she had done arithmetic on the day before, and she added a third number to the two already written on the back. And the third number was the number of dollars she would need at absolute minimum to keep the house from getting worse before the ground froze. And the third number was 78. She sat with those three numbers for a long time. Then she folded the envelope. She put it in her coat pocket. She banked the fire. She put on her coat, and she walked into the village. The village was a mile and a half along the road, uphill at first out of the flooded ground, and then a long flat stretch along a ridge from which she could see the whole valley of the Maryvale Creek laid out below her in the pale gray light. She saw her own house from up there. From the ridge, it looked exactly like what everyone in Winham County had told itself it was for 48 years. A ruin, a property to be pitied, a story to be told about a family that had lost its way. And the flooded acres around it from the ridge looked simply like poor drainage, like land that had gone bad, like nothing at all worth the trouble of a second look. Which was, Linnea understood now, precisely the point. Her grandmother had been very good at what she had done. She reached the village at mid-morning. The general store had a bell over the door that rang once when she came in and once again when it closed behind her. The man behind the counter was about 60. He wore a gray wool cardigan buttoned to the throat and a green eye shade pushed up into his hair, and he did not smile when he saw her. He did not smile either. He simply looked up from the ledger he was working in, marked his place with his thumb, and waited. She bought flour. She bought salt. She bought a small tin of tea. She bought 2 candles and a box of matches. She bought a wedge of hard yellow cheese and a jar of apple butter and a bag of dried beans. She bought, after some hesitation, a single sack of lime because she knew she was going to need it before the week was out, and she wanted to have it in the house. The shopkeeper totaled it. $2.87. She paid. He wrapped her things in brown paper and tied the parcel with kitchen twine. He handed the parcel across the counter to her. His hands were clean and his fingernails were cut short, and he did not meet her eyes. She would be at the Grange, he offered. Not a question. She confirmed it. He did not answer right away. Then, without looking up from tying a second parcel for a customer who had not yet come in, he told her winter came early up here. That was all. He did not offer a warning beyond it. He did not offer help. He did not offer credit. He simply informed her that the weather in Vermont did what the weather in Vermont did, and it was going to do it on schedule, and she should know. She took her parcel and she went outside. 2 women were standing under the awning of the shop next door. They were not at that particular moment doing anything. One had a market basket over her arm, and the other had a folded newspaper. They stood the way women stand when they have been talking and have just stopped talking because somebody they were talking about has come out of a door. Linnea walked past them. She did not turn her head. She kept her boots even on the boards of the sidewalk, and she went on down the street toward the road home. She had gone about 6 steps past them when one of them, not loud, not quiet, said one flat sentence into the November air, that the girl would not last the month. And the other one answered drier that Prescott would have it by spring. The word Prescott landed in Linnea's back between her shoulder blades like a small hard stone. Her stride did not change. Her hand tightened on the twine of the parcel. She kept walking. Prescott. Her brother's name in the mouth of a stranger in a Vermont village, where he had never, to Linnea's knowledge, set a foot. She thought, he has been up here. He has been up here, and he has talked to somebody about this house. She thought he expected me to fail. He expected it before I got on the train. She walked the mile and a half home with the parcel against her chest, and those 2 flat sentences turning in her ear like a tune she could not stop humming. And by the time she came in sight of her own gate, she had made a decision. She was going to last the month. She was going to last the winter. And the man who had said that name in the village was going to find out what a woman with $11.40 in a spine and a grandmother in a leather journal could do to a plan he had thought was already finished. The gate was open. She had left it closed. She stopped. For a moment she was afraid. She stood with the parcel in her arms and she listened. She heard the creak. She heard water dripping off the eaves. She heard from somewhere on the west side of the house the faint measured chalk of a hammer striking wood. She walked up the drive. Howe was at the west corner of the manor with the battered green canvas tool bag open at his feet. He had taken down a length of sagging gutter. He was standing on a short ladder replacing the wooden bracket that had failed, and he was doing it with a bronze rosehead nail and a hammer that he handled the way a violinist handles a bow. He did not stop when she came around the corner. He finished setting of the bracket. He climbed down. He picked up the length of gutter and he set it back into the bracket, and it seated with a small, satisfied click. And he stepped back and looked up at the line of it, and he adjusted one nail by a quarter turn, and then he was done. He turned. He looked at her. His pale blue eyes went to the parcel in her arms and to the sack of lime resting on top of it. And he registered the lime the way another man might register a book title on a shelf. Then he looked at her face. The bracket had been cracked, he told her. It would have taken the whole gutter in the first hard frost. Linnea set the parcel down on the stone bench beside the kitchen door. She waited. He put his hammer into the canvas bag. He did not look up. Ansel. She waited again. He did not add to it. She asked Ansel what. He fastened the buckle on the bag. He picked it up. He set it against the wall of the house out of the wet. Then he took a step back and looked at her properly for the first time that day. Whitfield. The name went through her the way a lit match goes through dry paper. Whitfield, the name in the journal. Two Whitfield brothers on the eastern parcel in 1858, boys who had grown up on this land under her grandmother's quiet accounts. She told him she thought he had known her grandmother. He did not answer right away. He looked past her at the sagged ridgeline of the east wing roof against the November sky. His face did not change, but something behind it did. Something adjusted, the way a man adjusts a load on his back before setting off again. I had worked for her 30 years, since he was 28. Then he picked up the tool bag and he walked down the drive, and Linnea stood by the kitchen door with the parcel of flour and salt and lime behind her on the bench, and she did not call after him, because she did not know yet what to call after him with. He was gone by the time she thought of it. She went inside. The house was warmer than it had been the day before. The kitchen held the heat from the morning fire. She unwrapped the parcel and put everything away. She hung her coat on the peg. She stood at the kitchen table and she pressed her palms flat on the honey-colored pine, and she breathed once, all the way in, all the way out. Then the afternoon post came. She had not expected post. She had barely registered on the walk up the drive that morning that there was a mailbox on a lopsided post at the mouth of the lane. But there was, and somebody had come by and put a letter in it while she was in the village, and she found the letter on the flagstones just inside the front door, where somebody, perhaps the same somebody, had shoved it under. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she picked it up. Neat, slanted, self-satisfied. Prescott. She stood in the drafty front hall with the envelope in her hand, and she did not open it for a long moment, because she knew before she opened it roughly what it was going to say. She had known since the moment she had heard his name in the village. Then she opened it. The letter was 2 pages on good ivory paper in Prescott's careful merchant hand. It began Little Allowan, which was a name he had used for her since she was 7 years old, and which had never been her name, because he could not be bothered to remember that her name was Linnea. Some children he liked, he called by nicknames. Some children he did not like, he called by nicknames that were not quite their real names. She had been Little Elowen since she was 7, and she was Little Elowen in this letter. It went on. I hope she was well. He hoped the journey up had not been too taxing. He wanted her to know, with all of the concern of an older brother, that he understood how impossible her position must feel. A widow, alone, in a house that was if the reports he had received were accurate, not really habitable. He wanted her to be reasonable. He wanted her to understand that he was not, despite what she might think, without sympathy for her situation. In fact, he wrote it was precisely because he had sympathy for her situation that he was writing. I was prepared to make her an offer. $200 for the manor and the 8 acres and every right and interest she now held in the estate. $200 wired to a bank of her choosing by Friday of the following week, and she could take the northbound train back down to Boston and put this entire chapter behind her, and she would have in her pocket $200, which was, he wrote with a delicacy he seemed to think was tacked considerably more than she had at present. He signed it her brother, who wished her only every comfort, Prescott. And there was a postscript. Little Aloan, be reasonable, dear. A widow's temperament is not built for structural undertakings. Linnea read the letter twice. She did not sit down. She did not lean against the wall. She stood in the middle of her cold front hall in her stockinged feet, with her wet boots by the door, and she read the letter twice, and then she read the postscript a third time, because she wanted to be sure she had understood it. A widow's temperament is not built for structural undertakings. She thought, he does not know I have found the journal. He does not know his name is being said in this village by women who have never seen my face. He is writing this letter to a woman he thinks is standing in a flooded parlor crying. She folded the letter along its original creases. She walked back into the kitchen. She set the letter down on the pine table beside the candle. She did not put it into the fire. She did not tear it. She did not answer it. She simply left it there. Because Prescott was going to have to wait for his answer. And the answer, when it came, was not going to be a letter. She turned to the wall. The library was down the hall. She had walked through the library the day before and seen its floor heaved up and its plaster hanging in strips from the lath, and its long east wall bulged outward from the settling of the timbers behind it. She had understood the library was going to have to come first, because the library shared a wall with the front hall and with the drawing room, and if the library wall gave way in a hard frost, half the ground floor was going with it. She needed to plaster. She had never in her life plastered a wall. She had watched a man do it once in the little brick house in South Boston when a section of the parlor ceiling had come down after a pipe leak. She had stood in the doorway with her arms folded and watched a bald man with a Polish name mix his lime and hair in a battered tin pail and lay it up with a trowel the size of a small book. It had looked at the time like the sort of thing a woman with her hands and her eyes could learn. She got out the sack of lime. She mixed it in a wooden bucket she found in the scullery. She used well water from the pump. She followed as best she could remember the recipe the bald man had used. Lime. Sand from a small pile behind the stable. A handful of horsehair she pulled out of the split seam of a mattress in one of the upstairs bedrooms because she remembered the bald man saying the hair kept the plaster from cracking as it cured. She mixed it with a length of pine lath until her shoulder ached, and she carried the bucket down the hall to the library, and she set it down under the worst of the failing wall. And she picked up an old paint scraper she had found in the pantry because she did not have a trowel, and she began. She was at it for 20 hours. She started at noon on that day, and she stopped briefly at dusk to eat a piece of bread with apple butter, and she went back to it, and she worked into the night by the light of 2 candles set on saucers on the library floor, and she was still working at 3 in the morning with the second bucket. She was on her knees then, on a chair, then back on her knees. She smeared plaster on the wall in long, slow strokes. She smoothed it as best she could with the flat of the scraper. She stepped back, she adjusted, she stepped back, she smoothed again. At 3 in the morning she stopped because she could no longer stand up, and she stumbled up the stairs to the dry room with her arms coated to the elbow in gray plaster and her hair full of it and her face streaked with it, and she fell face down on the mattress in her clothes, and the cat, which had watched her work most of the night from the doorway, jumped up onto the small of her back and settled there, and she slept. She dreamed of Wesley again. She did not remember what. She woke at 7. She washed her face at the pitcher. She went downstairs to see what she had done. The wall was cracked. Not hairline cracks. Long, deep fractures radiating outward from 3 separate points running across the surface of her 20 hours of work like a river system on a bad map. Chunks of plaster had already pulled away from the lath and fallen to the floor. She could hear, as she stood in the doorway of the library, another piece let go and drop with a small chalky thump onto the boards. She stared at it. She had gotten the mix wrong. The plaster was too wet. She had not let the coat set between applications. She did not know what she had done wrong exactly, but she knew standing in the cold library doorway in her stockinged feet that everything she had done the day before was ruined. 20 hours. She thought very clearly one word. Then she thought a second word. Then she put her hand over her face. She did not cry. She stood with her hand over her face for perhaps a full minute, and she did not cry, and then she took her hand down, and she looked at the wall again and into the empty library. Quietly, she told herself it was all right. That was all. She turned to go get the scraper because the failed plaster was going to have to come off before she could try again. And when she turned, she saw a man standing in the front hall. He had come in without knocking. He had come in without her hearing him. He was in the dark navy canvas jacket. The battered green canvas bag was set down by the front door. He was looking past her at the wall. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then without moving, "Too wet." Just that. She swallowed. She admitted she knew. Now. He walked past her into the library. He put one broad hand flat against the failed plaster without hesitating over the mess, and he pressed. His hand came away chalky. He looked at the residue on his palm. He wiped his palm on his trousers. The hair needed to be longer. The mix needed to sit a day before she laid it. She looked at his head. She observed dryly that he had longer hair. He turned his head half an inch. Something at the corner of his mouth moved and did not quite become a smile, but it was as close as she had seen him come to one. He would bring some tomorrow. He walked to the front door. He picked up the tool bag. He paused at the threshold. He did not look back at her. "Take the failed coat off today," he told her. "Down to the lath. Wire brush the joints. Let it dry overnight." Then he was through the door and gone, and Linnea stood in the ruined library with the letter from Prescott on the kitchen table down the hall, and a bucket of failed plaster at her feet, and her hands still gray to the elbow, and she thought, if you have made it this far, stay. Because what she finds behind that broken wall is why I wanted to tell you this story. She spent the rest of that day taking the ruined plaster off. She used the paint scraper and a wire brush she found in the stable, and she worked in a kind of stunned rhythm because she had not slept enough and she had not eaten enough, and she was still hearing Prescott's postscript in the back of her mind, and every time she thought of it, she scraped a little harder, and by 3 in the afternoon, the wall was down to the bare lath, and she had blisters on both palms and her arms shook. She was 3/4 of the way along the east wall of the library when the scraper punched through. It did not go through the lath. That was what she was expecting. She was expecting the tool to catch on a strip of oak lath and jar her wrist. Instead, the scraper met a soft, old, failed plaster patch, older than the coat she had just removed, older even than the last repair before that, and it went straight through the patch and kept going. It punched into empty air. Her forearm followed the scraper into the wall up to the elbow. She froze. She pulled her arm back. Dust poured out of the hole she had made. Not plaster dust, older dust. Dry, fine gray-brown, like the inside of a chest that had not been opened in a lifetime. It smelled faintly of beeswax, faintly of paper, faintly of something clean and sealed and old. She stepped back. She stared at the hole. She thought there is a room behind this wall. She thought immediately after I am imagining it. She thought immediately after that I am not imagining it. She worked with her fingers now, not the scraper. Carefully, she cleared the plaster away from the edges of the hole, and she saw beneath layer after layer of skim coat the outline of a frame. A door frame. Oak. Narrow. Perhaps 20 inches across. Not a house door. Something smaller. A closet, she thought. A pantry. She kept working. She uncovered the frame all the way. She uncovered a lintel. She uncovered at last the door itself, which had been faced over with a thin panel of pine, and then plastered and then painted and then plastered and painted again and again and again, so that 6 or 7 coats of the last 100 years lay over what had once been a doorway in a library wall. She uncovered the keyhole. It was small, brass, tarnished nearly black. It was set into the door at hip height, and it had been painted over with the rest of it, but the paint had never quite filled the hole itself, and she could see when she leaned close with the candle the small dark opening of a lock that had not been used in a very long time. Her hand went to her coat pocket without her deciding. The brass skeleton key on its frayed indigo ribbon. She held the key up. She looked at it. She looked at the keyhole. They matched. The ward pattern on the key, the shape of the hole in the door, they matched the way a hand matches its own glove. She slid the key into the lock. It went in as though it had been oiled that morning. She turned it. There was a moment when nothing happened. The tumblers resisted her the way tumblers resist the first turn of a key after 50 years of stillness. Then something inside the mechanism let go with a small, clean click, and the bolt shot back and the door under her hand sighed inward on hinges that had not spoken in a lifetime. Cold air rolled out of the opening. Not damp air, cold, dry mineral air, the air of a place that had been sealed. She had smelled that same air once before when a mason in South Boston had opened a chimney flue that had been bricked shut for 80 years and had shown Wesley and her the little blackened brick well inside. And she had smelled that same air then exactly. She held the candle up. The room beyond the door was narrow, perhaps 4 feet wide. It ran along the entire length of the library wall, 15 feet from front to back, and on both long sides were shelves. Simple shelves, deep made of the same pine as the library floor. The shelves held boxes. Some were wooden, some were tin, some were leather portfolios tied with cord. There were bundles of paper wrapped in oiled linen. There were what looked like account books, spines out in a neat vertical row along one shelf. And at the far end of the room, on a small wooden stand built for the purpose, sat a single large book, leather-bound, dark green, the size of a family Bible. She stepped inside. Her breath caught on the cold air. She stepped very carefully because the floor of this narrow room was pine, and it had not been walked on in decades, and she did not know how it would hold. It held. She reached the far end. She set the candle down on the stand next to the great green book. She put both hands on the book. It was heavy, heavier than she had expected. She lifted the cover. The first page bore in her grandmother's small, tight hand a title, The Merivale Accounts. Beneath the title in the same hand, a line explaining that the ledger had been kept in trust without acknowledgement for the families of Windham County from the year of our Lord, 1854, to the year of our Lord, 1907. By Ottilie Ashmere, recorded truthfully, not to be shown. Linnea turned the page. The ledger began as it said in 1854. 4 years before Ottilie had even come to Vermont. Ottilie must have started it in retrospect once she had understood what she was going to do. The first entry recorded $4 for winter fuel to a family named Ballard, delivered anonymously through the parish clerk. The second recorded $6 for a doctor's fee to a Rundle child pneumonia, February, delivered anonymously through the physician's office. The third recorded $22 for passage to seminary in Burlington for the second son of a Whitfield household, whose given name Ottilie had written out in careful letters. Halden, delivered anonymously through the seminary bursar. Linnea stopped at the third entry. Halden, Whitfield. She looked up from the page. Her hand had gone slack on the ledger. The candle guttered in a draft that did not exist. She stared at the far shelf without seeing it. Halden Whitfield. Ottilie had put a boy through seminary in 1854, 4 years before she had arrived at Merivale. And a man named Ansel Whitfield had walked up her drive and cleaned her chimney and had told her only that he had worked for her grandmother 30 years and had not offered his father's name. She turned pages. The ledger went on and on and on. 53 years of it. Every family in Windham County by the time she was 30 pages in. Some of them appeared once. Some of them appeared every year for decades. The Ballards, the Rundles, the Cranmers, the Loomises, the Whitfields, again and again, small sums, larger sums, a roof, a tuition, a funeral, a passage west. She read for an hour. She lost track of time. The candle burned down and she got another from her coat pocket. The room was cold enough that she could see her breath when she leaned over the page. At the end of the last entry in 1907 was a single line in a hand that was shakier than the earlier hand. Total sums disbursed 1854 to 1907, $4,200. Linnea sat down on the floor of the hidden room. Her back was against a shelf. Her knees were pulled up. The great green ledger was open on her lap, $4,200. Her grandmother had given away $4,200, 5 and 10 and 20 at a time, over 53 years to a village that had never known her name. Her hand was shaking. She pressed her palm flat against the page. She held it there until it stopped. She looked up. Beneath the ledger stand, tucked flat against the base, was a small tin box with brass corners. She had not seen it until now. She reached under and drew it out. It was not locked. She lifted the lid. Inside was a single folded sheet of thick cream-colored paper. Legal paper. The kind lawyers use for instruments meant to outlast the people who signed them. She lifted it out. She unfolded it. The crease cracked. It had been folded, she thought, for a very long time. The paper was a trust deed, drawn up on the 9th of March, 1877, by a firm of solicitors in Montpellier, whose name Linnea did not recognize. Witnessed by two names in careful clerkly script. Signed at the bottom in Ottilie's hand in ink that had faded from black to a deep rust brown. The instrument placed $4,200 in an account at the Montpellier Savings Bank at 3% compound interest to be held in the name of the estate of Merivale Grange and paid out upon claim to a beneficiary. The beneficiary was not named. The beneficiary line read only one line in Ottilie's own hand. To the woman of my blood who stays. Linnea read the line 3 times. Not a name, a condition, a verb. She turned the paper over. There were no further terms. There was no expiration. There was no alternate beneficiary. There was nothing at all except that one line and the compound interest term in the signatures. She sat with the deed on her knees for a long time. Then she took the pencil stub out of her coat pocket and she did the arithmetic on the back of Prescott's letter, which she had folded and used as a bookmark without meaning to. 4,200 times 1.03, 45 times. She had to do it in pieces because she did not have paper enough. She did it once. She did it twice. She checked it. The number that came out at the bottom of the third calculation was $16,100. She set the pencil down. She thought $16,000. She thought at 3% over 45 years, $4,200 becomes $16,100. She thought that is enough to re-roof the east wing. That is enough to drain the grounds. That is enough to make Prescott's $200 a joke. She sat with the deed in her lap and the ledger open beside her on the floor and the candle guttering on the stand above her, and she began without any sound at all to laugh. It was not the laugh she had laughed on the kitchen floor 2 days before at the water coming back over the threshold. It was a different laugh, a slower one. A laugh that came from somewhere she had not visited in a very long time. She laughed until her eyes were wet. Then she stopped laughing. Because she was looking at a page in the middle of the ledger that she had turned past earlier and had not looked at closely. And she was looking at it now in the candlelight because something on the page had caught her eye when she had come back to it, and she had not at first understood what. The page was dated 1889. It was in the middle of a long section of Ottilie's entries. Small kindnesses, a doctor's bill for a Ballard child, a funeral for a Loomis grandfather, all in Ottilie's small, tight hand, except for one line. One line in the middle of the page was in a completely different hand. The letters were angular, sharp, slanted the opposite direction from Ottilie's, written by somebody left-handed or by somebody who had been taught to write in a different country. The line read, Whitfield roof, north corner, 3 sheets, slate laid this day, no charge to household. And after that, in the same angular hand, 2 initials, H.W. Halden Whitfield. Ottilie had given a Halden Whitfield a college education in 1854. And 35 years later, in 1889, a Halden Whitfield had written a single line in Audley's private ledger in his own hand, in a hand nobody in the world had a right to write in, except Audley herself, and Audley had let him. Halden Whitfield had been in this room. Halden Whitfield had known, and Halden Whitfield had had a son. Linnea got very slowly to her feet. She left the ledger on the floor of the hidden room. She left the trust deed on the ledger. She took only the candle. She walked out through the narrow door and back into the library. She walked from the library down the hall and into the kitchen. The letter from Prescott lay on the table exactly where she had left it. She did not touch the letter. She sat down at the table. She thought about a man in a dark navy canvas jacket who had appeared at her gate on the morning after she had arrived, who had cleaned her chimney and fixed her gutter, and told her only when she pressed him that he had worked for her grandmother 30 years, who had said as though it cost him something since he was 28, which meant since 1892. The cat on the floor by the range looked up at her as she pressed both hands flat on the pine table and spoke into the empty room. He knew. Ansel Whitfield knew what was in that library wall. He had known the entire time. Somewhere in the house a floorboard settled. Somewhere else, further off, a piece of the ruined plaster from the library wall gave up its last hold on the lath and dropped to the floor and made a small chalky sound. She thought very slowly, the way she had been taught by her grandmother's handwriting to think. He had appeared at her gate the morning after she arrived. Not a coincidence. He had fixed the hinge pin the same day. Not a coincidence. He had cleaned the chimney the morning after that. Not a coincidence. He was here every morning. Not a coincidence. He was here because Audley had told him to be here. He was here because he had been waiting. She did not know for how long. She stood up. She went to the peg by the back door. She took down her coat. She put it on. She buttoned it to the throat. She picked up the letter from Prescott and she folded it once more and she put it in the inside pocket where the journal already was. She went to the drawer under the pine table and she took out a pencil and a sheet of writing paper. She sat back down. She wrote 3 lines. Prescott, the answer is no. Linnea. She folded the paper. She addressed the envelope. She stamped it with one of the stamps from her valise. She set it on the kitchen table where his letter had been. She would mail it in the morning. Outside, the last of the light was going. The cat came over and rubbed once against her ankle. The fire in the range had burned down to its low red bed. And somewhere down the lane in a small stone house at the end of a farm road, a man named Ansel Whitfield had, for reasons Linnea did not yet know, walked out onto his porch and had stood looking north up the ridge toward Merivale Grange, and had thought without knowing why that she had found it. Then he had gone back inside, and he had banked his own fire, and he had gone to bed, and Linnea sat at the kitchen table in the house she had inherited for $6, and she did not yet feel triumphant, and she did not yet feel afraid, and she did not yet feel angry. She felt for the first time in 4 years awake, fully, completely awake. Now let that sit. Because tomorrow morning when Ansel Whitfield came up the drive with a bundle of long horsehair from a friend in Bellows Falls, and a fresh sack of quicklime, and a plaster trowel that had once belonged to his father, Linnea, Ashmere was going to open the front door before he could raise his hand to knock, and she was going to look him in the pale blue eye, and she was going to say a single sentence to him. And Ansel Whitfield, who had spent his adult life around this house without ever being asked one particular question, was going to set the trowel down on the stone step very carefully, and he was going to answer her. But that came tomorrow. That night, $16,100 sat invisible and untouched in an account at the Montpelier Savings Bank. On the floor of a hidden room behind a library wall, 53 years of quiet accounts sat open beside a trust deed and a stub of pencil. On a pine kitchen table, a letter from a brother sat unanswered. Around the manor on 8 acres of ground her grandmother had drowned on purpose water sat black and still. And Linnea Ashmere blew out her candle and lay down in her clothes and pulled her coat over her shoulders and slept for the first time in 4 years without arithmetic running in her head, because the arithmetic finally had begun to run the other way. He came up the drive at 7 the next morning with a bundle of long horsehair under one arm and a fresh sack of quicklime on his shoulder and a trowel in his right hand. The trowel was old. The wooden handle had been worn down over years to the exact shape of a right hand that was not Ansel's. It had belonged to somebody with slightly smaller fingers. Linnea opened the front door before he could raise his hand to knock. She had been waiting an hour. She had brushed the plaster dust out of her hair. She had eaten a piece of dry bread standing at the kitchen window. She had put the journal in the inner pocket of her coat, and she had put the trust deed in a second envelope inside the same pocket, and she had watched the ridge road from the second-floor window until she saw a dark navy shape at the far bend a mile away, and then she had come down. He looked at her on the doorstep. His eyes went to her face and stayed there. He did not this time look past her at the wall. He did not this time look at the ridgeline of the east roof. He looked at her and something behind his weathered oak fence face adjusted, and he set the sack of lime down on the stone step very carefully, the way a man sets down a thing that could shatter. She told him she knew what was behind the library wall. He did not answer for a long moment. Then he set the trowel down beside the sack of lime. He set the bundle of horsehair beside the trowel. He straightened. He put his hands empty at his sides. He looked past her once briefly into the front hall, as if to be sure the door behind her was open and that the house had heard her too. Then he told her that she also knew he had been waiting. Linnea did not step aside from the doorway. She held it. She held the door open behind her with her left hand and the doorframe with her right, and she looked at him across the threshold and she asked how long. His pale blue eyes did not blink. The 3 freckles on his right temple stood out sharp in the morning light. 11 years, which she had already guessed, which she had guessed the night before at the kitchen table with the ledger on her knees. But hearing him say it aloud in his own voice in his own morning was a different thing than guessing it. Hearing him say it was like hearing a bell struck at the far end of a valley. The sound arrived late, and it kept going. She stepped back from the door. He picked up the sack of lime. He picked up the trowel. He picked up the horsehair. He came inside. He set the lime on the flagstone floor of the front hall. He put the trowel on top of the sack. He set the horsehair on top of the trowel. He did not take off his jacket. He did not sit down. She closed the door behind him. "Come with me." She walked him down the hall. She walked him past the kitchen and past the closed door of the drawing room and into the library. The morning light came in gray through the tall east windows. The failed plaster from the wall she had scraped down the day before lay in soft, chalky heaps on the floorboards. The narrow oak door in the east wall stood open exactly as she had left it, the little tarnished brass key still hanging from its lock on the frayed indigo ribbon. She turned around and looked at him. He was standing just inside the library door with his hands at his sides. His eyes were on the small dark opening in the wall. She watched him look at it. She watched him look at it for a full 10 seconds, and she saw without needing to be told that he had been in that room. He knew what it looked like from inside. He knew what was on the shelves. He knew at least in outline what the great green ledger on the far stand contained. He had not simply guessed at it. He had stood inside that hidden room on the pine floorboards at some point in the last decade, and he had looked at it the way a groundskeeper looks at a garden he has been asked to tend without ever pruning. He drew one long breath in through his nose. He let it out. Ottilie had shown it to him once he told her quietly. In 1908, she had not asked him to go inside. He had stood at the door. She had said only that this was what had to be here when she came. He had not asked who she meant. Linnea took the folded trust deed out of her coat pocket. She unfolded it. She held it up so he could see the beneficiary line. That she told him was what Ottilie had meant. He looked at the line. His face did not change. But his shoulders, which had been held very high the entire time she had known him, came down a quarter of an inch. To the woman of her blood who stays, he read aloud low, which meant he had read it before. She had suspected as much, but she had wanted to hear him say it, because the hearing was the thing. She let a long beat pass between them, and then she asked how far back this went. He gave her the years by way of an answer, the way a man might read out fence line dates. He had begun with Ottilie in 1892. He had been 28. His father had known her long before that. His father, he added after a small pause, had written a line in her ledger. In 1889, he had not told Ansel about it while he was alive. Ansel had found the entry 2 years later after Halden died in 1891, and he had understood it then. His father, he said, had been in the seminary at Burlington. For 2 years, he had come back to lay stone. Halden had told Ottilie once that the seminary was for a man who could stand in a pulpit and lie for a living, and Halden was not that man. Ottilie had laughed, according to Halden, and Ansel said it was the only time his father had ever heard her laugh. She had paid for the 2 years anyway. She had said an education was worth having, even if you did not use it the way the giver expected. He stopped. He looked at the floor. Then, quiet as father had taken the trowel from her house the year he died. She had given it to him. She had said it had belonged to her father-in-law. That was the trowel he had brought this morning. Linnea felt something behind her sternum give way. Not sharply, not painfully, the way a hinge gives when it has finally been oiled after a long, stiff winter. She looked at the trowel where he had left it on the sack of lime by the front door of the library. She looked at the worn spot on the handle where somebody's smaller right hand had gripped it 1,000 times. Then she told him quietly they had better use it. They plastered the east wall of the library that morning together. They mixed the lime dry first. He showed her how. He did not lecture. He did not narrate. He worked and she watched. And after a minute she understood without being told what she was watching, and she began to do it too. He turned the powder in the wooden bucket with the back of the trowel until it was uniform gray. Then he added the horsehair. He worked it in with his fingers. The hair was longer than the bat she had used the day before. 6 inches, some of it. It looked in the gray powder like the veins of a leaf. Then he added the sand, then the water, and only a little at a time. Her mix, she admitted, watching, had been too wet. Ansel nodded once. She had had it right otherwise. Just too wet. He handed her the trowel. She took it. She almost gave it back. She almost said, "No, you do this, I will watch." But his eyes said no. His eyes said, "It is your wall, and it is your grandmother's trowel, and it is going to be your hand that lays this coat." She laid the first pass along the bottom of the wall. He watched. He did not correct her. When she was done with the first pass, he took the trowel from her without a word, and he laid 3 feet of second pass across the top of her first, showing her the angle of the trowel against the wall. And then he handed the trowel back, and she did the next 3 feet the same way. And by the end of the morning, the wall was coated smooth from floor to ceiling in a single clean gray sheet. Neither of them said, "This time it will hold." Neither of them needed to. She made him tea afterward. He drank it standing in the kitchen with his back to the range. She stood at the pine table. Neither of them sat. The cat came in and rubbed against his boot, and he looked down at it without surprise. Ottilie's cat, he told her. Juno. She had been 6 when Ottilie died. She was older than she looked. Linnea looked at the cat. The cat looked back at her. He had been feeding her, every second morning, from the stable. He left the food inside the wall by the north door. She knew the sound of his boots on the gravel, which meant Juno had not in fact been waiting for Linnea. Juno had been waiting for Ansel. Juno had known Ansel her whole life. And the reason Juno had been in the dry room on the first night was because that was the room Ansel had kept dry for her. And the reason Juno had trusted Linnea from the first minute was because Juno had smelled Ansel on the flagstones, on the wood by the range, on the door frame, everywhere. The cat had not chosen her. The cat had been handed to her, along with everything else. Linnea sat down at the table. She looked at her hands. Her hands were gray with lime. She looked at the letter to Prescott, which she had put in the envelope the night before and had not yet mailed. She needed to drain the ground, she told him. Ansel set down his tea. He agreed. She said he knew where the covert was bricked. He did. Both ends. I knew how to open it. He knew how it had been closed. He could reverse it. It would take 2 of them. He could bring his nephew if she wanted a third. She thought about that for a moment before she answered him. Not yet. Just the two of them. For now. He nodded. How long, she asked. To open it a day if the frost held off. To drain the grounds 4 days, maybe 5. She let him have his tea and she let a beat pass and she asked about the ice house. He looked at her. She looked at him. They both knew what was in the ice house. Or if not what then, that there was a what. That the whole flooding had been a covering. That the whole ruin had been a covering. That whatever Audley had found beneath the drainage channel in the spring of 1874 had been serious enough to make a woman with a young marriage and a working estate decide to drown 8 acres of her own ground on top of it and keep drowning them for 48 years. 4 days, he told her, and she would see it. They started that afternoon. She wrote the letter to Prescott and she took it down to the village and she mailed it. And on the walk down, she passed the 2 women under the awning of the shop again. They did not look at her. They looked past her. And Linnea walked past them without slowing, and she thought without meaning to think it they will see. Then she went back up the ridge road with a spade Ansel had left for her by the gate, and they went to work on the covert. The upstream inlet was under 2 feet of clay and 48 years of silt. Ansel found it by walking the south lawn in a straight line for 11 steps from the corner of the stable, then turning 90 degrees left, then walking another 6 steps. He put the point of his boot in the ground. Here. She began to dig. She dug for 6 hours that day. He dug with her. They did not speak much. When they hit the brick facing at 4 feet down, at the very end of the first afternoon, she did not know what she was looking at for a moment. It was not what she had expected. She had expected stone. Instead, she was looking at a herringbone brick face. The bricks laid at 45 degrees, mortared with something that had turned to something harder than stone with the years. Ansel knelt down. He put his hand flat against the brick. Volcanic ash in the mortar, he told her. He had seen this on old bank vaults in Rutland. Her grandfather had known what he was doing. He had not wanted it open, she said. Not opened, Ansel said without looking at her, but only by himself. Then they went to bed. She slept that night in the dry room with the cat on her back, and the wind coming down the ridge from the north, and the sound of the covert waiting under her south lawn to be broken. She dreamed of Wesley again, and this time in the dream she was digging, and she was digging with the trowel that had belonged to her grandmother's father-in-law. And Wesley was watching, and this time Wesley smiled. The next morning was the reversal. Ansel brought a heavy pickaxe and 2 chisels and a maul. She brought her own hands. The bricks came out slowly. It took them until noon to open a hole a foot square in the inlet, and by then Linnea's hands were blistered through her gloves, and Ansel's forearms were streaked with clay to the elbow. The first water came through around 1 in the afternoon. Not a rush, a trickle, brown as steeped tea, smelling of iron. It ran down the inside face of the exposed covert and disappeared into the dark. They stood back. They watched it. Neither of them spoke. Then, without looking at her, Ansel told her that by morning the south lawn would be down 2 inches. He was wrong. It was down 3 by morning. If you have made it this far, stay. Because this last part is why I wanted to tell you this story. They worked on the covert for 3 more days. The water dropped, slowly at first, then on the second day all at once, as if the ground had made up its mind to give up what it had been holding for 48 years. Linnea would go out in the morning, and she could see on the trunks of the birches around the edge of the south lawn the successive brown tide marks where the water had stopped. First at ankle, then at instep, then at the very edge of the exposed root. Then on the 4th morning, no water at all around the trees, only wet flattened grass, and beneath the wet flattened grass, the yellow-green pallor of grass that has not seen sun in a decade. The lawn came up, and in the middle of it, where nothing had been before, a shape began to emerge. Curved stone, fitted stone, cut by hand a very long time ago and set together dry. A low dome rising perhaps 4 feet above the flat of the lawn arched cleanly. A doorway arched no more than 4 feet high set into the north face of it. A heavy iron lock on the door. The iron was orange with rust, but the lock was intact, and the stone dome itself on its west side extended out beyond the flat of the lawn, and hung unsupported on 3 iron braces over the shallow drop where the ground fell away toward Maryvale Creek. From the creek side, if you had ever looked up from the water, you would have seen a small stone chamber apparently hanging in the air above the bank. From the lawn side, you would have seen only a mound. It was the ice house. She had not in her first 3 days at the property understood the shape of the south lawn. Now with the water gone, she understood it perfectly. Her grandfather had built an ice house on the very edge of a limestone shelf that dropped away to the creek. He had built half of it into solid ground and hung the other half out over the ledge on iron. And then when Ottilie had opened the covert in 1874 and had seen whatever she had seen beneath the channel floor, they had done something extra. They had rerouted the covert. They had bricked the original channel closed, and they had let the water come up around the ice house until nobody could see the ice house anymore. The ice house had been under her feet the entire time. Linnea stood on the edge of the exposed dome on the fourth morning with the brass skeleton key in her hand. Ansel stood 2 paces behind her. The cat sat on a stone by the stable watching. She spoke over her shoulder without turning. He had never been inside it, she said. No, Ottilie had never shown him. No, he did not know what was in there. He knew what she had told him. Not what was in there. She waited on that. How was quiet a moment. Then low he repeated it for her. What was under the water was not money. She had said it was proof. Linnea walked down the slope of the exposed lawn, and she knelt in front of the iron door of the ice house, and she put the brass key into the lock. The lock resisted her. She turned harder. It gave. The door swung inward on hinges that groaned once and then were silent. Cold air rolled out, not damp air, the air of a place that had been sealed since 1874. She had to bend to go in. She bent. She lit her candle at the threshold. She went in. Ansel came in behind her. The ice house was small, perhaps 10 feet across at its widest. The floor was flagstone, dry flagstone. She could see along one wall the old rack where blocks of ice had once been stacked. The rack was empty. Along the other wall, on a low wooden bench, sat a single oak chest. The chest had brass corners. It was the chest she had seen in her mind from the moment she had opened the ledger 3 days before. She knelt beside it. She lifted the lid. Inside were papers. Papers wrapped in oiled linen. Papers in leather portfolios. Papers loose and bound. On the very top, folded once, was a heavy document on the same cream-colored legal paper as the trust deed. She took it out. She unfolded it. It was a will, dated the 12th of October, 1904, signed by Ottilie Ashmere, witnessed by 2 names in the same clerkly script as the trust deed, filed with no one. The will began with a formal preamble in Ottilie's hand. She, Ottilie Ashmere of Maryvale Grange in the county of Windham, in the state of Vermont, being of sound mind and full memory, did thereby revoke all previous testamentary dispositions and declare this to be her true and only last will and testament. Linnea read the first paragraph. She read the second. She read the third. She stopped at the third paragraph. The third paragraph left Maryvale Grange and all its lands and all its rights and all its appurtenances to the woman of her blood who stayed at the property for a full winter and drained the grounds and opened the ice house. Not by name, by deed. Ottilie had left it to the granddaughter who did exactly what Linnea had in 6 days done. Linnea read the paragraph twice. Then she read the fourth paragraph. The fourth paragraph left the 40 acres of adjacent farmland, which Linnea had not known she owned and had believed had been sold off decades before, and which Prescott had been leasing to a developer in Brattleboro for the past 3 years to the same beneficiary. The 40 acres had never been sold. Ottilie had never sold them. The sale Prescott had claimed had never happened. Linnea sat down on the flagstone floor of the ice house. The candle guttered. Ansel took it from her hand without a word and set it in a niche in the wall so that it would not go out. He had been leasing land that was not his, she said mostly to herself. Ansel did not answer. He did not need to. She kept reading. There was more. There was beneath the will a folded sheet in a different hand entirely. A woman's hand. Sharp. Slanted. Not Ottilie's. Linnea unfolded it. It was signed at the bottom Halcyon Ashmere, and it was dated the 4th of November 1911, 6 days before Ottilie's death. Halcyon Ashmere had been Ottilie's younger sister. Linnea had met her once at the same funeral where she had seen Ottilie for the last time, and she remembered her only as a stern, narrow woman in a black coat who had not spoken to anyone. Halcyon had died the year after Ottilie. In the winter of 1912, Linnea had been 13. Halcyon had written this letter evidently from Ottilie's bedside in this house in the last week of Ottilie's life. She had sealed it. She had put it in the ice house herself because who else could have? And she had left it for whoever came. The letter was addressed to the woman of their blood who would find it. Halcyon wrote that Ottilie was dying that night or in the morning. Ottilie had asked her to tell the reader a thing Ottilie could not put into her own will without opening a wound she did not wish to open in ink. Halcyon, she wrote, was not bound by that. The reader's Uncle Prescott, born to the reader's father by his first wife Iolanthe, was not entitled to the Ashmere name. Iolanthe had married the reader's father in 1878. The certificate of that marriage was on file in the county clerk's office in Wyndham. The reader's father had believed, and Ottilie had believed, that Iolanthe had been widowed the previous year in Providence. That was untrue. Iolanthe's first husband, a man named Beecham, had not died in Providence in 1877. He had died in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1881. Iolanthe had married the reader's father under a false claim of widowhood and had thereby entered into a bigamous marriage and had thereby produced a son, the reader's half-brother Prescott, who bore a name to which he had no legal right. Iolanthe had destroyed the copy of the true certificate she carried. She had not destroyed the copy on file in Fall River. That certificate, Halcyon wrote, remained in the clerk's office at Fall River to that day. Ottilie had learned of this in 1902 through a woman in Providence who had known Iolanthe as a girl. Ottilie had not told the reader's father because he was already dying, and she had not wished him to die knowing his marriage had been a fraud. She had told Halcyon. She had told no one else living. If Prescott ever attempted to press a claim against the reader or against the property, the letter together with the certificate at Fall River would end that claim in an afternoon. Halcyon was telling this because Ottilie could not. Halcyon was also telling this because Ottilie had loved the reader. She had loved her before she was born. Signed, Halcyon Ashmere, 4th of November, 1911. Linnea read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it inside the will. She put the will back on top of the papers in the oak chest. She closed the lid. She stood up. She looked at Ansel. They needed to go to Boston, she told him. He did not ask why. He nodded. She said she needed a lawyer first. Somebody in Vermont. Somebody not from Boston. Bess Rundle, he answered. Montpelier. 68. One of the early women admitted to the Vermont bar. Ottilie had known her mother. She looked at him then, and she asked him how he had known she would need a lawyer. He looked back at her. He said he had known a woman like her would need one. Whichever woman came. Bess had been waiting too. Not as long as he had, but long enough. They took the trust deed and the will in Halcyon's letter in the great green ledger to Montpelier by train on Wednesday. Bess Rundle was a tall woman with iron-gray hair pinned in a practical low twist, and her office smelled of cedar and India ink and the faint smoke of a small coal stove in the corner. She read the 4 documents at her desk without a word. It took her 40 minutes. Then she looked up. Her voice was measured and slow, and each sentence rolled to its full end before the next one began. When a will was redrafted by the son of a man's second wife, she said they called that in Vermont a suspicious pattern. When the same son claimed to have sold a parcel of land that had never left the estate, they called that fraud. When his mother's marriage to the deceased father turned out to have been contracted while she was already the wife of another living man, they called that the end of any claim he might bring to any part of this estate. She folded her hands on the desk. He had nothing, she said. He had never had anything. And when they sat down with him, he was going to understand that he had never had anything. Linnea did not answer. She did not need to. Beth Rundle looked at her across the desk with the closest thing to a smile Linnea would ever see cross that particular face. Boston, she said, Friday. They met Prescott in the same solicitor's office on Beacon Hill where the original will had been read 6 weeks before. Pembroke was there. Prescott was there. Prescott had brought 2 men from the Boston bar with him, both in black frock coats, both younger than he was. Both of them wearing exactly the expression of men who had been paid handsomely and had been assured the afternoon would be brief. Linnea walked in with Bess Rundle at her side. She was wearing the olive green coat with the brown thread patch at the elbow. She had not changed it. She had not felt the need to. Her auburn hair was pinned back with her mother's tortoiseshell clip. Her boots were the same brown boots with the cracked left sole. She had brushed the lime out from under her fingernails on the train down. That was the only concession she had made. She did not sit at the foot of the table. She sat at the head. Prescott's face registered that. It registered it very briefly. He recovered. He consulted his gold pocket watch. He set the watch face down on the mahogany. Little Eloan, he began. Bess Rundle spoke unhurried without raising her voice. He would refer to her client as Mrs. Marchand or as Miss Ashmere, or by no name at all. He would not refer to her by any pet name of his own devising. Did they understand each other? Prescott looked at Bess Rundle for the first time. Something in his face went still. They understood each other, he conceded. Linnea did not speak. She reached into her coat pocket. She drew out the first document. She placed it on the mahogany table. She slid it across. The original will of 1904. Pembroke picked it up. He read the first line. He read the second. He set the paper down very slowly. Linnea drew out the second document. She placed it on the table. She slid it across. The great green ledger. Not the full ledger. She had left the ledger itself in Bess Rundle's safe in Montpellier. What she slid across the table was a certified copy of the final summary page, prepared by Bess in the presence of a notary the day before, showing the 53 years of quiet accounts. The total of $4,200 dispersed the names of every family in Wyndham County who had received a sum and the compound trust deed of 1877 that had grown from those disbursements. Prescott looked at the certified copy. He did not touch it. His face had begun to lose color at the ledger. It kept losing color as he read. Linnea drew out the third document, Halcyon Ashmere's sealed letter. She had not opened the seal since the ice house. Bess Rundle had recommended keeping it sealed until this moment. Linnea placed it on the table, sealed in front of Prescott. She spoke for the first time. Open it. I did not want to. He looked at his 2 lawyers on either side of him. Neither of them met his eyes. He looked at Pembroke. Pembroke was looking at the table. Prescott opened the letter. He read it. His face did not change while he read, but something inside it did. Something that had been holding him upright since 1888, when his mother had died, and he had been 9 years old and had been told by his father that he was to be a Boston Ashmere and to carry the name well. Something that had been holding all of that in place gave way. He set the letter down. He did not look at his lawyers. He looked at Linnea. Bess Rundle spoke into the silence, her voice still measured, still without haste. The county clerk at Fall River held a copy of the true marriage certificate. She had sent a boy on the 8:15 from Boston Tuesday morning. He had returned Wednesday afternoon. The certificate was exactly where Halcyon Ashmere had said it would be. It had been sitting in drawer 47 for 41 years. She paused. Additionally, she added Prescott's solicitor. Mr. Pembroke might wish to consider whether his continued representation of an estate under the terms of a will he had reason to know had been superseded constituted conduct warranting review before the bar. She made no accusation that afternoon. She merely observed that a complaint filed in the proper form would be received and would be investigated. That applied also to Mr. Halloway and Mr. Vint beside him. The 2 younger lawyers did not move. Bess Rundle turned her head half an inch toward Prescott. By her count, he had three options. He could attempt to contest this in court, in which case the letter, the certificate, the will, and the ledger would all be entered into public record, along with the fraudulent lease of the 40 acres in Wyndham County to the Brattleboro Land and Improvement Company, which would additionally interest the state attorney general. He could attempt to negotiate a settlement, in which case her client would decline. Or he could sign that afternoon a full release of any claim he might imagine himself to hold in the estate of Audley Ashmere. And he could walk out of this office and he could go on with his life in whatever direction he chose, provided that direction did not intersect with her clients again. She folded her hands. He had 30 minutes. Prescott did not use 30 minutes. He used 12. He signed the release his own lawyers drew up on the spot. He signed it in his own hand, in his own careful merchant script, and he did not look at Linnea when he signed it, and he did not look at Linnea when he stood up, and he did not look at Linnea when he buttoned his charcoal frock coat over his burgundy waistcoat, and he did not look at Linnea when he left the office. He walked out. He did not say anything on the way. His two lawyers followed him. Holloway paused at the door long enough to wish Miss Rundle a good afternoon. Bess Rundle returned the courtesy in the same measured voice she had used the whole afternoon. Then the door closed, and Pembroke, who had said nothing, the entire meeting sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the mahogany table for a long moment. And then he spoke quietly without lifting his eyes. Audley had told him once in 1907 that she had written another will. He had never asked to see it. He should have insisted. He had not. He was sorry. Linnea looked at him. He had known, she said. He had suspected. He had not known. He had chosen not to know. There was a difference, he admitted. It was not much of one. She said nothing. Pembroke looked up at last. He was old. She had not registered before how old he was. There were liver spots on the back of his hands. He would draft the transfer of the 40 acres that afternoon. He would not bill the estate for the work. Then he stood with some effort, and he walked her to the door of his own office, and he opened it for her, and she went through, and Bess Rundle followed, and they went down the marble stairs to the street. And Linnea Ashmere, who had come to Boston on a January afternoon in 1923, with an olive green coat and a spine, and a woman lawyer from Vermont, walked out of the building that held her father's old solicitor and her half-brother's disgrace. And she stood on the sidewalk in the cold gray light of Beacon Hill, and she did not smile. She did not need to. Prescott sold the Beacon Hill house in April. He moved to Providence. He was not heard from again. The community payback began the second week Linnea was home. Mrs. Cramer came first. She was 74 years old, and she carried a bundle wrapped in wet newspaper up the drive on foot on a cold Tuesday morning, and she did not knock. She waited at the front door until Linnea saw her from the kitchen window and came out. Mrs. Cramer unwrapped the newspaper. Inside was a length of dormant rose stem. Brown, woody, two shriveled buds. Weather took everything Mrs. Cramer told her, and her voice cut its sentences short at the last necessary word. Except roses. Audley had given the original of this cutting to her mother in '93. Her mother had rooted it against the south wall of their kitchen garden. The bush was 30 years old. This was the first cutting she had taken off it in a decade. Linnea was to put it in the ground by the south wall of the walled garden. It would take. It always took. Then Mrs. Cramer turned around and she walked back down the drive, and Linnea stood in the yard with a rose cutting in her hands, and she watched the woman go. A young farmer named Loomis came on Thursday. He was 30, thin, sunburned in November for reasons Linnea did not immediately understand. He carried folded in his coat pocket a contract for spring hay off the eastern field, and he handed it to her without meeting her eyes. And he told her, ma'am, 4 times in one sentence that he would be honored to put an offer down on hay for the season. His father had worked the eastern field for her grandmother from '98 to 1911. He knew the ground. He knew how she liked it worked. He said ma'am 4 times because he did not know how else to address a young woman who was now the largest landholder in the county. Linnea took the contract. She signed it. She wrote a deposit receipt on the back for the sum he offered. He shook her hand with a hand that shook worse than hers ever had, and he left. Judith Ballard came on the following Monday. She was 72. She was a small woman. Her back was still straight. She walked up the drive with a hawthorn walking stick, and her white hair was pinned tight at the nape of her neck, and there was a small dark freckle on her left cheekbone. She did not knock either. She waited at the door as Mrs. Cranmer had, and when Linnea came out, Judith Ballard did not offer a cutting. She did not offer a contract. She held out a single piece of paper. The paper was yellow with age. It was folded twice. Linnea took it. She unfolded it carefully because the creases were fragile. It was a receipt, dated the 3rd of April, 1867, written in Audley Ashmere's small, tight hand, received of Audley Ashmere for the tax on the north farm of Amos Ballard for the year 1866, the sum of $9.40, to be considered a gift in perpetuity and not to be repaid, and signed at the bottom in Audley's own hand with her full name. Linnea looked up from the receipt. Judith Ballard was watching her. And then Judith Ballard spoke in the voice of a woman who had spent her life measuring the seasons by what her father put into the ground. Her father, she said, had put the first apple tree in that north corner the year Linnea's grandmother had paid their tax. He had never known who paid it. Her mother had known. Her mother had kept that receipt for 62 years and had told her on her deathbed and made her promise not to speak until the right person opened this house. Her mother had said when the right one came she would know because the water would be down and the ice house would be open. And here she was, and here Linnea was, and the water was down, and the ice house was open. Then Judith Ballard held out her hand. Linnea took it. The two of them stood on the doorstep of the house for a long moment, and neither of them said anything further because there was nothing further to say. And after a while, Judith Ballard stepped back and she turned and she began to walk down the drive again. At the gate, she paused. Without turning around, she offered mildly that she knew how to keep books. Her father had taught her. If Linnea ever had need of an accountant for this place, she knew where Judith lived. Then she went. By the following spring, Linnea had signed 3 papers. One kept the manor and the 8 acres and the 40 adjacent acres in her name, with a third interest in the working revenue of the farm and the nursery. One transferred a third interest in the working revenue to Ansel Whitfield on installment against work performed and to be performed calculated against actual seasonal income, so that in a bad year he owed less and in a good year he owed more, and no year required him to owe more than the ground had actually earned. Ansel signed his name with the same care he had brought to laying the last coat of plaster on the library wall. The third paper transferred a third interest to Judith Ballard on the same terms for her services as accountant and farm bookkeeper. Judith Ballard set up her small desk in the front parlor of Merivale Grange, which had by then been replastered and floored and warmed and hung with lace curtains from a widow's estate sale in Wyndham. And she came up the drive every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday morning at 8. And she went home again at 4, and she kept the accounts of the manor in a hand that was clean and clear and unhurried. The motto, if Audley had ever spoken, one had been written on the inside cover of the great green ledger in her tightest and most careful hand. Water hides, stone remembers. Ansel had said it once on the second day of digging out the covert when Linnea had cursed the clay and had thrown down her spade. He had picked up the spade. He had handed it back to her, and without looking at her, he had told her that water hides. Stone remembers was what Audley used to say. Linnea had said nothing, but she had put the spade back into the clay. And in the spring of 1923, when she inscribed the first page of the new ledger, the ledger of the working manor from 1923 forward, she wrote under the date in her own hand, "Water hides, stone remembers," and underneath that in a smaller hand, "The rest is just staying." The bridge over Merivale Creek was a footbridge, 22 feet long, old planks, no handrails. Ansel had crossed it every workday of his life since he was 16 years old, and he had crossed it every workday of his father Halden's life before that, and neither of them had ever spoken on the bridge. Not one word from one side to the other. It was a habit Halden had brought back with him from the seminary. Something about crossing water. Something about not carrying words over running water. Ansel had inherited it without ever being told why. Linnea noticed it in February. She noticed him fall silent as his boot touched the first plank. She noticed him not answer her until his boot cleared the last plank on the far side. She did not ask about it. But on a Sunday afternoon in June of that year, Judith Ballard's 8-year-old granddaughter, a small brown-haired girl named Astor, came up the drive with a jar of preserves from her grandmother. Astor stopped at the near end of the footbridge, and she looked at the water and she did not speak, and she walked across the 22 feet of old planks without a sound, and she did not speak again until her foot cleared the last plank on the far side. Linnea, watching from the yard, understood without being told that Astor had learned the habit somewhere. Astor had learned it from Ansel, who had crossed the bridge with her the week before to check on a fence line, and Ansel had learned it from Halden, and Halden had learned it from a seminary teacher in Burlington in 1856. 3 generations, passed on without a word. Linnea did not say anything to Astor about the bridge. She simply watched her cross it, and she thought, this is how a place holds together. This is how a place remembers. The rest was staying. A young woman came up the drive on a cold Tuesday morning in the second week of April 1923. She had a thin coat that was not warm enough for Vermont in April. She had no valise. She had no cat. She had no key. She stood at the gate for a long time before she came in. Linnea saw her from the kitchen window. She recognized nothing about the woman except her own face at 23, standing at that same gate in November of 1922, holding a leather valise and a brass skeleton key on a frayed indigo ribbon, and looking at 11 inches of water and not knowing yet how to begin. Linnea did not ask her name. She went to the door. She opened it. She took a key from the hook beside the door, a brass key, not the original, a copy Ansel had cut for her in Montpellier that winter. She put the key in the young woman's palm. She put an envelope with $20 in it in the young woman's other palm. And she pointed down the west corridor toward the last door on the left, the dry room which had stayed dry through the winter and would stay dry through this one and would stay dry through the next. Her voice was steady, and it carried the exact rhythm of her grandmother's handwriting, which was the exact rhythm of a spade going into clay, which was the exact rhythm of a footbridge being crossed in silence. Water hides, stone remembers, the rest is just staying. Then she closed the door behind the young woman, and she walked out into the yard, and Ansel was there with a length of rebuilt gutter across one shoulder. And Judith Ballard was there with the account book in her arms, and Juno the gray cat with the notched left ear and the white tip on her tail was there, sitting on the stone bench by the kitchen door watching them all. And the sun came out over the ridge for the first time that April, and it warmed the manor in the walled garden where the rose cutting from Mrs. Cranmer's mother had rooted against the south wall, and it warmed the reopened south lawn where the ice house sat under its low dome of dressed stone, and it warmed the footbridge over Merivale Creek, and it warmed the woman at the head of the drive who was 23 years old and was a widow and was an heiress and was a landholder and was most of all the woman of her blood who had stayed.